Hello. In the Crown of Aragon, 639 years ago, it was February 17th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. In 1387, February 17th was a Sunday, and I think that explains why I had a bit of a problem locating letters, documents from this day. I'm really trying to track whether there seem to be fewer letters and documents from the Saturdays and the Sundays. So I went to Daniel Girona y Llagostera's itinerary, and he has listed the document that we're looking at today in his itinerary that tracks a document for every day of the reign of Joan and places his location. So Daniel Girona y Llagostera has done a really wonderful service to my mission, which is to actually have at least one document a day for every single day of Joan's reign, and even actually he did this for when Joan was the Duke of Girona. He did not do it for Violante de Bar, so sometimes it's harder to find documents for a particular day for Violante. Today's document is in the register that's labeled Curie, C-U-R-I-E, and in my understanding thus far, that means the court, the king's court. And so I believe that these documents have more of a group authorship than what we would see in other registers. I'm kind of coming to a better understanding of some of the organization of the archive of the Crown of Aragon. I'm also on a reinvigorated mission to really untangle some of the Latin abbreviations in the probata section, the signature of whatever chancery scribe was copying down the letter. And so we're going to look at some of that today. This particular document is, I think, something that I have a good understanding of, even though it's in Latin. And I feel kind of good about myself because I'm trying to have a good growth mindset about Latin and how it's very difficult for me, but if I think of it as a puzzle and then I have a bit of a helper in terms of the AI chatbot, then I can make some progress. And little by little, I'm getting a sense that when I encounter a Latin document, especially if it's a short one like this, then it's within my grasp. So I'm happy to say that I'm quite sure about the general content of this letter, but we're going to get a little bit more into the sourcing of it first. So again, I think that this is a letter from the court, that this is something not necessarily attributed to Joan as like an individual decision on his part, but is more about the business of maybe a governing council or a group of people that, of course, Joan has final say over. The addressee of the letter is the Vicario of Roussillon. That's the Latin term. And this, I'm pretty sure, is translatable to Veguer. So in Catalan, Veguer. We've encountered Veguers in earlier documents, and they're basically a chief administrative authority for the state in a particular region. So the overlap between bailiff and Veguer can be a little bit confusing for me, but I think that the Veguer has more authority. And this is not somebody that is an employee or an authority under the municipality. This is definitely a person who reports back to the overall government of the Crown of Aragon, the larger state above the municipality. So we have the addressee. We've got a little bit about possibly the authorship here as different from, say, a letter that Joan himself would have written or dictated. And so now let's get into the content of the letter. It appears that there's a fellow named Guillem or Guillermo de Modes or de Modes. And I'm a little shaky on that last name because modus is a Latin word, but I'm pretty sure it's the surname of Guillermo. This Guillermo is currently, I think, arrested and imprisoned. He's, I'm pretty sure, referred to as a captive, and he is in money trouble. There's a word in line 5 of this letter that has survived from its ancient Roman usage all the way into English today. And that says something once you hear what this word is. The word is creditor. So when somebody has lent you money and you owe it to them, that person is your creditor. And goodness, it's telling that this is one of the Latin words that has survived in its spelling and in its meaning across the ages and across all of the linguistic development that took place as classical Latin got broken into all these regional vernaculars. Yes, people have been lending money and have been owing money pretty much consistently for a very, very long time. So the word creditor is very stable over time and place. Here in this letter, we've got a Latin ending on the word creditor. So the word as it reads on line 5 is creditoribus. Now, the IBUS ending can make the word creditor either the dative or the ablative. And what that means is that the word creditor could be functioning in the sentence as if it was with the preposition to, that would be the dative, to the creditors, and that is plural. And then it could also be something like with or for or about the creditors. That last scenario would be the ablative. And then if we were to say to the creditors, that would be the dative. So I've given you a little bit of a grammar lesson there in terms of Latin grammar, but all of that is to illustrate something that I've mentioned a couple times, but I haven't really taken the time to break down with an example, which is that in Latin, the nouns have endings, and it can change the function of that word in the grammatical sense of the sentence. So this makes it very difficult to unpack when translating, because you have to, in a sense, decide, like in this case, well, what is the preposition that's being used before the word creditors? And if you have a lot of these in a sentence, you can get very easily tangled up in how the phrases are put together. And in fact, one word at the far end of a sentence can refer back to a word way earlier, and sorting this out can be incredibly time consuming. So I just wanted to draw out this one example in order to help you understand why it takes me sometimes several hours, even after getting the help from an AI chatbot, to figure out the meaning of a Latin document. Now, that's not even taking into account the paleographical challenge. Line 5, the same one that has the word creditoribus, also has a really difficult paleographical challenge. The first word in that line, the initial letters are small, and it's like, I think the scribe forgot the word that he had intended to write and then added in a prefix later. So he had one word in mind as he was copying the letter, and then maybe looking back at it, or like halfway through the line or something, he realized, oh wait, that's not the right word. And so he squeezed something in, and you can totally tell that he did it because he's really good otherwise about starting the lines in a way that they're all lined up. They're all, very well, I guess we would say, justified according to the margin. So it's clear to me that what happened here is that the scribe had intended to write, well, what I figured out eventually, non nollis, and accidentally wrote simply nollis, and then later on came back and put in an N-O with a macron on top in order to put in the N-O-N for non nollis. So that really changes the meaning, because it's basically putting a negation prefix in front of the word. And then what it turns into when you have non nullis is several. Like, it's the equivalent of saying, like, not none. But it's not, to say that in English is not very colloquial, at least these days. And so in Latin, it's not as weird sounding to say non nullis. It just means several. So the phrase we have here is to several of his creditors, because the next word is suis, which is his, possessive. All right. So I did not immediately recognize the little letters that were added after the initial writing to the left of nullis on line 5. I thought that possibly there was a letter M followed by an O, because I guess to me it looks like there really could be like 3 minims, and I think the scribe intended to write 2 minims. I don't know. You kind of look at the N in nullis and then compare that to what's being squeezed in there to the left, and you can see that there's maybe an intention to have the letter N, but at first glance it really looks like it could be the letter M. And so initially, when I put in my transcription into ChatGPT, ChatGPT returned this idea that it was the word monelis and that this was referring to coinage. And it had this very confident statement that monelis was common in medieval Latin to refer to coinage, which I had never heard before. And so I had some doubts, and in the transcript later, after asking it to search for this Guillermo, it didn't really find anything. After that, I returned to this earlier question about its interpretation, monelis, and it turns out that ChatGPT just made that up. And there was just no basis for it to say that it was a common word for coinage in medieval Latin. So this is a really good lesson to hit home the fact that as of February 2026, these large language models, these chatbots, they cannot be depended upon 100%. They are tools, but you've got to treat them as helpers and rough guides and not as the final authorities. When I am using the AI chatbots, which I use like all the time to help me with translation, I always take it with a grain of salt, and I'm always looking to see if there is something I can catch it at, because I know that situations like this happen, and I'll bet you that in probably over half of what I've done with the AI chatbots, I've missed something like this. So you just cannot use them as a solid 100% foundation. You've got to use them as a rough guide, a starting point for future work, not as the end of your knowledge building process. Great example in this one. All right, I mentioned earlier that I'm reinvigorated in my search for unpacking the probata information. Just look at the probata for this document. It's almost like the scribe added extra curves, little like river pathway curves to the probata symbol at the end, because he knew that there was a lot going on. Just compare it to the probata that appears higher up in the page that's associated with the document that ends the first half of this folio. And so there's a lot of abbreviation. I definitely can see that in the third to last and second to last words of the first line of the probata, we've got ex pro, but then that word that begins with F, not quite sure what's going on there. There's an abbreviation at the end that could be a UM, but I'm not sure. And then I definitely see second to the last word in the last line of the probata, fuit, but I don't know what's coming after that. So I asked another AI helper, Perplexity, to do a search to see if there were any articles that really just kind of broke down what's in the probata. And it didn't really find anything directly, but it did come up with an article by Joan Bertrand Todoli about some of the Archive of the Crown of Aragon practices. And in that, there was a citation from one of our friends of the show. I mean, not literally. Don't know him, but he comes up all the time. Josep Trenks Iodena. He co-authored a book with Antonio Maria Argo and Rafael Conde Delgado de Molina about the documentary notarial practices of the Archive of the Crown of Aragon. So I'm ordering that through interlibrary loan, and that might have some information about the probata because it was cited as possibly really breaking down some of the chancery practices into a longer explanation. It was cited by Beltran Todoli. So I'll put both these sources in the bibliography, and stay tuned in the coming weeks for more. Yeah, Shadow, stay tuned. I know. For more information about the probata, we are going to crack it. I have a feeling. All right. Should I re-record that, Shadow, or should we leave your little exclamation meows in? I think we'll leave you in. I think people like hearing you. At least when it's not quite as shrill as it could be. All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I have done my job. Remember, the motto of the Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.